Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. Thanks for coming by. This is part two of a four-part reading of Guy de Maupassant's Boule de Suif, translated by Roger Collette, Jimmy's favorite translator of Guy de Maupassant. We left off with the coach now. There's 10 people leaving Rouen, and they're trying to get to Le Havre. They got a permit to travel, and we left with three couples: man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, and four muffled figures. Okay, that's where we left off. Let's continue. Okay, the ladies at the far end had brought with them some little copper foot warmers heated by the chemical fuel, and they now lit these contraptions, extolling their advantages for some time in low voices, and repeating to one another facts of which they had long been aware. So the ladies have foot warmers, right? The ladies at the far end. At last the coach was ready, with 6 horses harnessed to it instead of 4 because of the extra effort required in the snow. And a voice outside asked, "Is everybody in?" And a voice from inside replied, "Yes." And they started off. So who was the voice outside? It was the ostler. Remember the guy who was hooking up the horses? So the coach moved slowly and laboriously. The wheels sank into the snow and the whole vehicle creaked and groaned. Imagine yourself in a coach like this in these days, right? The horses slipped and panted and steamed, and the driver's huge whip cracked incessantly, darting in every direction, tying itself into knots, and then uncoiling like a slender snake, and suddenly stinging some rounded crupper, which promptly tensed into a greater effort. See, you think they whip the horse. They don't whip the horses. They're right above them, just to keep them going. Imperceptibly, the darkness began to give way to light. Okay, remember, they've been in darkness. They're muffled, they're cold, they're bundled up, and it's dark, pitch black outside. There's no things like lighting, like you travel on the highway, you got some lights. If you're on a highway and every now and then you can see inside a car, right? The fall of feathery snowflakes, which one of the travelers, a Rouen man born and bred, had compared to scraps of cotton wool, stopped. So there's a Rouen man that compared the falling snowflakes to cotton wool. We'll try to figure out who that is in a minute. A dingy light filtered through the huge lowering clouds whose laden colors set off the dazzling whiteness of the countryside, against which there stood out here a row of tall trees coated with frost, and there a cottage under the cowl of snow. Inside the coach, the travelers inspected one another, inquisitively, in the melancholy light of dawn. In the best places at the far end, Monsieur and Madame Louisiot, wholesale wine merchants in the Rue Grand de Pont, sat dozing opposite each other. So inside, you got Monsieur and Madame Louisiot. Now, what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to keep track of these for you. And you should keep track of them on a piece of paper. Would you do that for Jimmy? Would you do that for Jimmy? Would you please? Do that for Jimmy, and then you can track with me as we go through here and we learn who these characters are. So they're opposite each other. They're dozing. Once the clerk to a wine merchant who had gone bankrupt, Louisiot had bought the business and made a fortune. He had sold very bad wine at very low prices. Who's narrating, ladies and gentlemen? Who's narrating? Yes, please. Let's write it down. Third person narrator. Okay, so we have to believe what he's telling us about Mr. and Mrs. Louisiot. So he bought the business from a guy, right? Very bad wine. He sold very bad wine at low prices to small retailers in the country and was regarded by his friends and acquaintances as a cunning scoundrel. A typical Norman, full of guile and joviality. A typical Norman Frenchman, right? Cunning, scoundrel. Look those words up. His reputation as a crook was so well established that one evening at the prefecture, a local celebrity called Monsieur Tournelle, an author of songs and stories and a man of sharp and caustic wit, suggested to the ladies, who seemed a little drowsy, that they should ask Monsieur Louisiot to teach them "Beggar My Neighbor." So this is a little sidebar to give you a taste of this guy's character that the narrator is giving us, right? The witticism had spread rapidly through the prefect's drawing room, the prefecture, right? Prefecture, so some big shot. And from there to other drawing rooms. Drawing rooms in those days were where people gathered. They met. There's no television. There's no cell phones. They met in drawing rooms, right, of these people. So it spread in the town, setting the whole province laughing for a month. What's "Beggar My Neighbor"? It refers to an economic and trade policies that a country enacts that end up adversely affecting neighbors and trading partners. "Beggar My Neighbor" is also known as strip Jack naked, beat your neighbor out of doors, and beat Jack out of doors, or beat your neighbor card game. Who knows? But anyway, this guy, Monsieur Tournelle, made a joke about Louisiot, saying that Louisiot should teach the ladies "Beggar My Neighbor." Louisiot himself was famous for practical jokes of all kind, good and bad, and nobody could mention his name without adding immediately, "Oh, Louisiot, he's a real card." He was a small man with a large pot belly and a red face framed in grizzled side whiskers. Got it? A small man, large pot belly, red framed face with grizzled side whiskers. Got it? His wife, a tall, stout, strong-minded woman, shrill-voiced and quick to make decisions. She ran the firm. She did the bookkeeping, while he kept the business alive with his jovial vitality. So he's the sales guy, right? She runs the business. She's the CFO. Next to them, so you got Mr. and Mrs., right? Monsieur and Madame Louisiot. Next to them, and more dignified, as befitted a member of the superior social class, sat Monsieur Carré-Lamandan, a man of substance with a solid position in the cotton business, the owner of 3 spinning mills, an officer of the Legion of Honor, and a member of the General Council. So now we could probably guess that the guy who compared snowflakes to cotton wool is Monsieur Carré-Lamandan, right? Carré-Lamandan. Throughout the period of the empire, he had remained the leader of the benevolent opposition politician, simply in order to extract a higher price for his support of a policy which he fought, with what he called gentlemanly weapons. Madame Carré-Lamandan, who was much younger than her husband, had been a constant comfort to those officers of good family who were quartered in Rouen. Stop. She had been a constant comfort to those officers of good family who were quartered in Rouen. Who are those officers, ladies and gentlemen? That's right, the Prussians. She sat facing her husband. So these people are facing each other so far. Monsieur Louisiot and his wife, and Mr. Carré-Lamandan. She sat facing her husband, a dainty, pretty little thing, muffled up in her furs, gazing disconsolately at the depressing interior of the coach. Okay? So she's muffled in her furs. She's a dainty little thing, Her neighbors next to them was the Comte and Comtesse Hubert de Brevet, born one of the oldest and noblest names in Normandy. Remember, in those days, they had social classes, right? So this is the Count and the Countess. The Count, an elderly nobleman of distinguished appearance, did all he could to accentuate by the artifices of dress his natural resemblance to King Henry IV, who, according to legend of which the family was very proud, had gotten Madame de Breville with child, rewarding her husband by making him a count and the governor of a province. Sorry. So the count thinks he looks like Henry IV, who gotten Madame de Breville with child, right? Rewarding her husband, he had an affair by making him a count. So he's descended from Henry IV, theoretically, through whatever, through a little shenanigan. The Count Hubert served with Monsieur Lamondon. So there's now here, I'm keeping scores for you here, right? We got these people. Now don't look at these yet, but you got these. These are the three couples. The Count served with Monsieur Carré Lamondon on the General Council, so politicians, where he represented the Orleanist party in the department. The story of his marriage to the daughter of a small native shipowner had always remained a mystery. But as the Countess had a distinguished manner, was an incomparable hostess, and was said to have been a mistress of one of Louis Philippe's sons, the local aristocracy all paid court to her, and her salon, drawing room, was the most exclusive in the region, the only one where old world courtesy survived, to which access was difficult. Are you getting the picture, ladies and gentlemen, of these people? Right? So she had been said to be the mistress. So there's a lot of shenanigans going on with these upper class people. Got it? The Breville's fortune, which was all in landed property, was set to produce an annual income of 500,000 francs. That's a lot of money. 500,000 annual income in landed property, pardon me. So we have a guy in cotton, we have a wine merchant, and we got a guy in property, right? Two of them serve on the General Council. Louis Zio is the wine merchant, jovial guy. So these six persons occupied the far end of the coach, representing the moneyed, self-assured, solid element of society, the respectable, privileged folk with the proper respect for religion and morality. That's the third person narrator telling you this after he just got through telling you how they got their fortune and why they're vain. These, we're talking about vain people here, right? Vain, vanity. So he's saying these six people are proper respect for religion and morality. Now, why is he telling you that? Why is he telling you this? Well, I'll give you a hint. Because it's going to impact the rest of the story. So pay attention. By a strange coincidence, all of the women were seated on the same side. And next to the Comtesse were two nuns telling their beads and muttering Pater Nostras and Ave Marias, Aves, right? So there's two nuns sitting next to the Countess, right, on that side. So you got all the women on one side, you got all the men on the other side, except for these other two people we're going to meet in a minute. Got it? Got that picture in your head? One of the nuns was an old woman whose skin was pitted with smallpox, as if she had received the charge of grape shot full in the face at point-blank range. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to picture that. Do you know what? First of all, you got to look up what smallpox is. It's a really horrible disease, worse than measles. Right? Chickenpox. Jimmy had chickenpox before there was chickenpox vaccine. And Jimmy had the measles before there was measles vaccine. That's how old Jimmy is. And I'm still here. So when they say a pox be upon you, don't worry about it. In any case, smallpox is not chickenpox and it's not measles. It's worse. So he's describing this nun whose pitted skin is smallpox, like she was charged of grape shot, that's buckshot, in the face at point-blank range. Can you imagine that? The other nun was a puny creature with a pretty, sickly-looking face and the narrow chest of a consumptive, eaten up by that devouring faith which makes martyrs and visionaries. Consumption is a horrible disease. It sinks, you sink in. So she's got the chest of a consumptive, eaten up by devouring faith, which makes martyrs and visionaries. So she's very pious. He's painting a picture of a pious nun. Well, they're both pious, right? They're saying Our Fathers and Hail Marys. They're praying on their beads. And what? They're just muttering this. They're praying, telling their beads and muttering. They're praying out loud, muttering. Hail, Our Father, Hail Mary. They're muttering. Opposite the two nuns were a man and a woman who attracted everyone's interest. Mm-hmm. The man was a well-known figure, Cordenet, the Democrat, the terror of all respectable people. For 20 years, he had been dipping his long red beard in mugs of beer in all the Democratic cafes. And with the help of his friends and comrades, he had squandered a sizable fortune inherited from his father, a retired confectioner. And he was waiting impatiently for the coming of the Republic to obtain at long last the official position that he had earned with so many revolutionary potations. So this guy is like a Republic guy. The French Revolution had already occurred, and he wants the coming of the Republic. So he's waiting around. He's a Democrat. On the 4th of September, possibly as a result of a practical joke, he had got the idea that he had been appointed prefect. Prefect is like mayor. But when he tried to take up his duties, the office messengers, left in sole charge of the prefecture, had refused to recognize him, and he had been forced to beat a retreat. He was a good-natured fellow. Though inoffensive and obliging, he had devoted himself with incomparable enthusiasm to organizing the defense of the town. So he had tried to organize the defense of Rouen, right? He had had pits dug in the open country. All the young trees in the nearby forest felled, and booby traps scattered all over the roads. Satisfied with his preparations, he had hurriedly withdrawn into the town on the approach of the enemy. And now he thought that he would be more useful at Le Havre, where new defensive positions would have to be established. So he seems to be a patriot, right? He organized the defenses. It didn't work, obviously. But now he thinks he may be more of use over there. It makes you wonder why he didn't go down the road to those other 3 towns and start killing the Prussians, right? But there he is in the coach, and it's a wonder that he got a permit to go through here, right? Because he's basically a Democrat. He's a Republic, right? He doesn't want these Germans in there. Finally, the woman, one of those who are generally known as of easy virtue, was famous for her premature corpulence, and had earned her the nickname of Boule de Suif, or suet dumpling. Stop. What's the title of the story? Boule de Suif. And now we come to the main character. So, ladies and gentlemen, pay attention. This is the main character of the story. All these other people are supporting cast, correct? Now we meet the name of the story, Boule de Suif, which means suet dumpling, or roughly translated, if you want, ball of fat. So she's prematurely corpulent. What does she look like? Short, completely round, fat as a pig, with puffy fingers constricted at the joints like strings of tiny sausages, taut, shining skin, taut, tight, and huge breasts swelling underneath, right? Underneath her dress. Her freshness was so attractive that she nonetheless remained desirable and much sought after. So here she is, Boule de Suif, right? Let's go back a moment. Generally known as of easy virtue. What does that mean? Yes, she may be a prostitute. Okay? There it is. Easy virtue, prostitute. Okay? She was famous. She describes her. She's a ball of fat, right? Suet dumpling. But she's fresh and attractive and very desirable. Listen now further. Her face was like a ruddy apple or a peony bud about to burst into flower, and out of it looked two splendid black eyes, shaded and deepened by thick lashes. And beneath them was a charming little mouth with moist, inviting lips and tiny, gleaming teeth. Isn't that beautiful? She was also said to possess many other inestimable qualities. Uh-huh. As soon as she was recognized by the respectable women began to whisper among themselves, and the words prostitute and absolute scandal were whispered loudly enough to make her, Boule de Suif, raise her eyes. The look she gave her neighbors was so bold and challenging that there was a sudden silence, and everybody dropped their eyes, except for Louisiot, who fixed a lecherous gaze on her. Uh-huh. You know what a lecher is? He's lecherous. Uh-huh. The conversation was soon resumed between the three ladies, whom the prostitute's presence had suddenly made friends, almost intimates. Do you understand chemistry? I want to talk about this for a second. Look at this note here. The chemistry of people in a group. Have you ever experienced such chemistry? If you are talking to another person and having a private conversation, casual conversation, and somebody you know walks in and says, "Hey, Jimmy, how you doing?" And he sits down, suddenly the chemistry changes. Would you agree with that? Of course it does. And if you're in a group and it's a chemistry, people are chemicals. We are all made of chemicals. And when you mix chemicals, sometimes you can have an eruption. Right? You can have an explosion if you mix the wrong chemicals. It's the same thing with people. People are people, and some people get along, some people don't get along, some people fight, some people don't fight, some people run, right? Chemicals, chemical reactions. That's what you're going to witness here. Why? Because the three ladies whom the prostitute's presence had suddenly made friends, almost intimate. She's a prostitute. They're not. They're respectable, right? It was their duty, they felt, to confront this shameless whore with their united marital dignity. For legalized love always looks down on its free colleague. Think about this. This is the third-person narrator. Legalized love looks down on its free colleague. Well, maybe not anymore in these days. Who knows? Marriage is plummeting in the United States, right? Well, that's for another story. In this story, the narrator, the third-person narrator, is telling us legalized love always looks down on its free colleague. That means legalized love is maybe not free. What's the price you pay for being married? You're supposedly paying for. Well, we already see signs here, right? Louisiot's looking at Boule de Suif with lecherous eyes. He's lecherous. That's what you know what it means. He wants her, right? The three men, too, drawn together by conservative instinct at the sight of Courtenay, started discussing money matters in a tone that showed a certain contempt for the poor. See, these guys, I'm rich. Count Hubert spoke of damage the Prussians had caused him. The losses that he had suffered in stolen cattle, ruined crops, with the assurance of a great landowner, a millionaire 10 times over, who would recoup all of these losses in less than a year. Think about that. The Prussians are devastating him, right, with his land, but I'll get it back in less than a year. Monsieur Curé Lamondon, right, who had been hit hard by the cotton business, had taken the precaution of sending, listen to this, 600,000 francs to England. So I have to have something stored away for a rainy day. Think about this. They're talking to each other. I've taken the precaution of sending 600,000 francs to England for a rainy day. Don't forget what's going to happen, right? One of them said, I think it was him, that if Le Havre doesn't work out, he's going to England. As for Louisiot, he had arranged to sell the French commissar all the cheap wine that he had left in his cellars so that the state owed him a large sum of money, which he hoped to collect at Le Havre. So none of these men they're all about money. I want you to think about money. Money is going to be essential. Let me write that down. I'm surprised Jimmy didn't write that down. Money. Money's going to be at the central discussion when we analyze this story. Because don't forget what a prostitute does. Sex for money, right? That's what a prostitute is. Well, Jimmy, you're really supposed to talk about that? No, we're in the story. And if you think that doesn't happen nowadays, please, ladies and gentlemen, please. So these guys are talking about money. One says, I'll recoup it, blah, blah, blah. All three exchange quick, friendly glances. And although they belonged to a different social class, they were conscious of being brothers in wealth, members of that great Freemasonry of the well-to-do who can always be sure of having money to jingle in their trouser pockets. That's the narrator telling us this about these three guys. The coach moved so slowly that by 10 o'clock in the morning, they had covered less than 10 miles. Imagine less than a mile a minute. Oh. The men got out 3 times to walk up the hills. Why? Because the coach was too heavy to go up in the snow. They were beginning to get worried, for they had intended to lunch at Totes. And now there seemed to be little hope of their arriving there before nightfall. So everybody was keeping a lookout for a wayside inn when the coach got stuck in a snowdrift. And it took 2 hours to pull out. Increasing hunger began to affect the company's spirits, but there was no sign of an eating house or a tavern, since the approach of the Prussians and the passage of starving French troops had scared all the train away. The gentleman tried. Now you know why the narrator painted the picture before of the retreat of the French troops, of the Prussians. Now you know why he painted that picture, the third-person narrator. And I refer to he as the narrator in the universal sense. Could be a she, but it's the third-person narrator. So there's no food. There's no food. The gentlemen tried to get food from the farms by the roadside, but they could not even obtain any bread, for the suspicious peasants had hidden their stocks away for fear of being robbed by the soldiers who, with nothing to eat, were taking by force anything they found. Bad luck, right? About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Louisio announced that there was no doubt about it. He had an aching void in his stomach. Remember, they started out in the morning before daybreak, right? Everybody had been suffering in the same way for a long time, and the craving for food, becoming more steadily acute, had killed all conversation. Before I go on, I want to relate a story from a movie called Hombre. Hombre was with Paul Newman. He was an Indian police officer who inherited a house. And like in Boule de Suif, they were in a coach after he sold the house, getting out of town. There was an Indian agent and his wife. It was Paul Newman, another lady who was the caretaker at the house that Paul Newman inherited, and a couple of other people. But anyway, they were in the coach, and a discussion came up about the Indian reservation, of which Paul Newman, who was, by the way, a white man, but he grew up on the reservation. He was an officer. He was a police officer on the reservation, and he worked for the Indians. These were Apache Indians. So the topic of hunger came up, and they were talking, and the Indian agent's wife said how striking the men and the Indians were in their when they would walk around on the reservations with no shirt on, and they were just striking, beautiful specimens, right? She was anxious to say that, and then she added, but they eat dogs, which they did. So Paul Newman caught that, and he's listening to this conversation, and he goes, have you ever been hungry? He joins the conversation. Up until then, he's just been listening. And you should see the movie. And he says, have you ever been hungry? And the Indian agent's wife says, I don't care how hungry I was, I would never eat a dog. And Paul Newman looks at her and very calm, very calm, not smiling, no expression. He said, you'd eat it and you would fight for the bones. Because he says, if you've ever been hungry where you fill your stomach, you just can't stand, you haven't eaten in days and days, right? You would, in fact, you would eat a dog and you'd fight for the bones. And she just says, I wouldn't do it. I'm not saying that these people are that hungry, but I'm saying if you've ever been hungry, not just for another burger or whatever, but I want you to think about hunger, food, and money, and the people, and the personalities that the third person narrator is painting. So they're so hungry, no more conversation. From time to time, somebody yawned, and almost at once, somebody else would follow suit. The yawn is the most infectious disease in the world. Every person, according to his character, yawned in turn, breeding and social position. They either opened their mouth noisily, right? Or they politely put his hand in front of the gaping, steaming orifice. Think about that. Their mouths are gaping, steaming orifices. You know what that means, right, ladies and gentlemen? What does that mean? Right? An orifice is their open mouth. And why is it steaming? It's cold. It's cold. Several times, Boule de Suif bent down as if she were looking for something underneath her petticoats, and then she would hesitate for a moment, glance at her neighbors, and then quietly straighten up again. And her face was pale and drawn. Loisio declared that he would give 1,000 francs for a knuckle of ham. And his wife made as if to protest, "What are you doing?" But then subsided. It was always painful for her to hear of anybody talking about throwing money away, and she couldn't even understand jokes on the subject. "I must admit I don't feel at all well," said the Count. "Why on earth didn't I think of bringing some provisions?" Sorry. Everybody was blaming himself for this. The reason I'm laughing is because if you were hungry, would you talk like that? Who talks like that? Well, a Count does, right? Why on earth didn't I think of bringing some provisions? Everybody was blaming himself for the same omission. Cornadet, however, had a flask of rum. He offered it around, but he met with cold refusal. Only Loisio accepted a drop, and when he handed back the flask, expressed his thanks. "That's good stuff all the same. It warms you up and it takes the edge off your hunger," says Loisio. The alcohol put him in good humor, and he suggested imitating the sailors in a song about a little boat and eating the fattest of the passengers. What a jerk! What a jerk! What a jerk! This indirect allusion to Boule de Suif shocked his more refined companions. Right? Nobody said a word, and only Cornadet smiled. The two nuns had stopped mumbling over their rosaries and were now sitting motionless, their hands thrust in their long sleeves, and their eyes stubbornly downcast, no doubt offering up to heaven the suffering it was inflicting on them. At last, at 3:00, when they were in the middle of an endless plain without a single village in sight, Boule de Suif bent down quickly and brought out from under her seat a large basket covered with a white napkin. From it, she first took a small china plate and a dainty silver drinking cup, and then a huge pie dish containing 2 whole chickens, carved up and embedded in aspic. Other good things could be seen carefully wrapped up in the basket: pâtés, fruit, other delicacies. She packed enough food for 3 days' journey, so as not to have to touch the fare provided in the inns. And the necks of 4 bottles protruded from among the packets of edibles. She took the wing of a chicken, and began eating it daintily with one of those small rolls of bread which are called Regency rolls in Normandy. Notice she takes the wing. Eyes were fixed on her. Then the smell of food spread throughout the coach, making nostrils distend, mouth waters, jaw muscles twitch painfully under the ears. What a writer. The lady's contempt for the hussy grew into a ferocious longing to kill her or throw her and her out into the snow with her drinking cup and her basket and all her provisions. Her. But Louisio was devouring the pie dish and its contents with his eyes. Well, he said, there's no denying Madame had more foresight than the rest of us. Some people think of everything. She looked at him. Would you like some, monsieur? She asked. It's no fun going without food all day. He bowed. How do you bow when you're sitting down? Frankly, I can't refuse. I'm at the end of my tether. But you've got enough. You've got it rough in wartime, don't you, Madame? And glancing around the coach, he added, at times like these, it's good to meet somebody who will give you a helping hand. He had a newspaper which he spread over his knees so as not to dirty his trousers, and with the point of a knife, which he always carried in his pocket, he speared a leg of chicken, thickly coated with jelly, tore into it with his teeth, and munched away with such obvious relish that a great sigh of distress went up from his companions. In a low, respectful voice, Boule de Suif invited the nuns to share her meal. They both accepted immediately, and without raising their eyes, they began eating very quickly after stammering their thanks. Cornadet didn't refuse his neighbor's offer either, and the four of them made a sort of table by spreading newspapers over their knees. Mouths opened and shut without pause, swallowing, chewing, gulping ravenously. Loisio, eating away in his corner, urged his wife in a low voice to follow his example. She held out for a long time, but after a pang of hunger, which went right through her vitals, gave in. And then her husband, in a well-turned phrase, asked their charming companion if he might offer Madame Loisio a small portion. Certainly, monsieur, she replied with a pleasant smile, and she handed him the dish. A difficulty arose with the first bottle of claret, which was open, and there was only one drinking cup. They passed it around, and each person wiping it in turn, Cornadet alone, presumably out of gallantry, put his mouth to the rim where it was still moist from his neighbor's lips. One of the best lines I've ever heard in an old movie. I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to embarrass myself if I tell you the name of the movie. But it was where a Greek mythology character was going to eat a big, big chunk of lamb or whatever the heck he was cooking on a spit, and he offered it to the lady that was traveling with him, and she took a dainty bite, and it was Hercules. Okay, it was Hercules. And he took the big thing. It was a big, lamb shank or whatever the hell it was, and he said, "I will start where your lips have touched." Sorry. Surrounded by people eating and drinking and half choked by the smell of food, the Count and the Countess, de Breveril and Monsieur and Madame de Kerlemandon suffered the agonies of the hideous torment associated with the name Tantalus. Who's Tantalus? Tantalus is a Greek myth because of his hubris. He wanted to test the god's ability to know everything. So in secrecy, he murdered his sons and he served them to the gods in stew. And when Zeus found that out, he cursed his family and as a result condemned Tantalus to the afterlife when he would be thirsty and hungry for eternity. These Greeks really had mythology. Jimmy, make a note. You should read mythology, Greek mythology sometimes. I'm going to do that with you, ladies and gentlemen. They're great stories. And because you should know Greek mythology, when you read a word like this is called an allusion, Allusion, not illusion, Allusion, not illusion. Look up what an allusion is. It's a reference to a story, something that happened before, something that's usually a literary reference. So if you didn't know what I just told you about Tantalus, you would lose meaning. You wouldn't understand what they're talking about. These people are suffering. All of a sudden, the manufacturer's young wife heaved a sigh and attracted everyone's attention. She was as white as snow outside. Her eyes closed. Her head fell forward. She's lost consciousness. Her distracted husband appealed for help. Everybody was at a loss except for the elder of the two nuns who, supporting the young lady's head, forced the rim of Boule de Suif's drinking cup between her lips and made her swallow a few drops of wine. The lady stirred. She opened her eyes, smiled, and declared in a faint voice that she felt quite well again. But to prevent a repetition of what had happened, the nun made her drink a whole cupful of claret, saying as she did so, "It's nothing but hunger." And then Boule de Suif, blushing in confusion. Why do you blush? Why do you blush? Why do you turn red? You're embarrassed. We talked about this in some of our other stories. So Boule de Suif is blushing in confusion. This lady just fainted. She looked at the four travelers who were still fasting, and she stammered, "Heavens, if I only dared offer these ladies," she broke off, feeling a rebuff. She didn't want to, they're higher class than her. She wants to offer them food, but Loisio came to her rescue. "Damn it all," he said. "In a case like this, we're all brothers in adversity, and we ought to help one another. Come on, ladies. Don't stand on ceremony. Accept her offer. Well, we can't even be sure that we're going to find a place to sleep tonight. And at this rate, we shan't get to toast before midday tomorrow." There was a pause, nobody wanting to take responsibility of saying yes. But it was the Count who settled the question. Turning to the fat, shy woman and assuming his lordliest manner, he said to her, "Madame, we gratefully accept your offer." Asshole. Sorry. The first step was the only difficulty. Once the Rubicon had been crossed, they all set to with a will, emptying the basket. Rubicon! What do you call that, ladies and gentlemen? An illusion. What is the Rubicon? This phrase, crossing the Rubicon, is meaning passing the point of no return. You know who did this? Julius Caesar. In the Roman tradition, you were not allowed to bring any troops into Rome, but during Caesar's days, he crossed the Rubicon with his army and brought them into Rome. That's called crossing the Rubicon. You can't turn back, right? You can't turn back. So they all start taking it, right? It still contained pâté de foie gras, a large pâté, a piece of smoked tongue, and some cressine pears, a slab of, she brought a lot of food, cheese, fancy biscuits, a jar of gherkins, pickled onions, for Boule de Suif, like all women, loved sharp flavors. Isn't that the truth? If you're a woman out there, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, come on, tell me. If you're a woman, do you enjoy sharp flavors? Jimmy loves pickles, and I'm a guy. It was impossible to eat the woman's food without talking to her. You think? So talk to her they did. At first with a certain reserve, and then, since her manners seemed very good, with a greater freedom. Madame de Breville and Madame Carré-Lamandan, who were women of the world, were gracious and tactful. The Countess in particular showed the kindly condensation of a great lady whom no contact can possibly smirch, and was very charming. The stout Madame Loisio, who had the soul of a gendarme, policeman, but, she remained surly, saying little, but she was eating a lot. The conversation naturally turned on the war, the atrocities perpetrated by the Prussians, and the gallant deeds of the French. And all these people who were fleeing for their lives, they paid tribute to the courage of those who were staying behind. And before long, they got on to personal experiences. And Boule de Suif, with a genuine emotion and that vigorous language which women of her profession sometimes employ to express their feelings, she told them how she had come to leave Rouen. So now we get a little insight into Boule de Suif. I thought at first that I would be able to stay, she said. My house was full of food, and I preferred feeding a few soldiers to going to heaven knows where. But when I saw those Prussians, it was more than I could stand. They made my blood boil, and I cried with shame all day. If only I were a man. I used to look at them out of the window, those fat swine with their spiked helmets, and my maid had to hold my hands to keep me from throwing the furniture out on their heads. And then some of them were billeted on me. And when I went for the throat of the first one who arrived, they're no harder to strangle than anyone else. I'd have them done for him, too, if they hadn't dragged me off by the hair. And after that, I had to go into hiding. And finally, I got a chance to leave town, so here I am. What an amazing story. Now, the third-person narrator is telling us she's narrating this. Now, it's the third-person narrator, so we have to believe her. I don't think she's lying. Do you? She tried to kill a Prussian, right? So now she's leaving. She was warmly congratulated, and she had risen in the esteem of her companions, who had been far less courageous, you think? Cornadet smiled as he listened to her with the benevolent approval of an apostle, like a priest hearing a devout member of his flock praising God. For bearded Democrats think that they have a monopoly on patriotism, just as men in cassocks do of religion. That's the third-person narrator giving us insight. Cornadet is looking at her, oh, of course, I'm a ho, right? He spoke in his turn, laying down the law with the pomposity learned from the proclamations posted on the walls every day, and he wound up with a peroration, the concluding part of his speech, that's what this is, in which he gave verbal trouncing to that scoundrel Bonaparte, as he called Napoleon III. Now, you have to know a little bit about the French, right? Bonaparte is the nickname given to Napoleon III, is the name of the workman whose clothes he wore when he contrived to escape from Fort Ham in 1846. You got to read about Napoleon. It's not necessary to understand this story, but Napoleon, right, was in fact the guy after the revolution that almost conquered Europe. He made a mistake by trying to fight the Russians. He opened up two fronts and lost. So descendants of Napoleon, right, were revolutionaries. But this scoundrel, as he called Napoleon III, because he's not. He's a Bonapartist. He's a dictator. We don't want any dictators. Boule de Suif immediately flew up, for she was a Bonapartist. She liked Napoleon. She turned as red as a turkey cock, and she stammered with indignation, and she cried, I'd like to seen you lot in his place. A nice mess you'd have made of it. It's folk like you that have let him down. And if France was governed by blackguards like you, there'd be nothing for us but to clear out. So she doesn't like Cornadet. She's in favor of Bonaparte, Napoleon. Lots of turmoil. Is this any different than sometimes what goes on in every country, right? You got factions fighting factions, blah, blah, blah. Cornadet was unmoved, and he continued to smile, his superior, disdainful smile. But it was obvious that high words were soon going to be exchanged. So the Count intervened, and not without difficulty, he pacified the exasperated young woman, that's Boule de Suif, declaring authoritatively that all opinions sincerely held were entitled to respect. Nonetheless, the Countess and the manufacturer's wife, who nurtured in their hearts the irrational hatred felt by all respectable people for the Republic, and that an instinctive admiration that all women have for flamboyant and despotic governments, were drawn in spite of themselves to this dignified prostitute whose convictions were so similar to their own. So a lot of time, well, Jimmy, I don't believe this. This is not true. All women don't feel like this. Forget about that. Look into the story. This is the third-person narrator. Stay inside the story. Stay inside this. He's saying instinctive admiration women have for flamboyant and despotic governments, dictators, right? Strong men. Look at history, ladies and gentlemen. Don't look today. Don't look what you think is coming tomorrow. Look at history. Look at history. The basket was empty. Whoops. The 10 travelers had made short work of its contents, and their only regret being that it was not larger. Conversation continued for a while, but in a somewhat chillier atmosphere after the end of the meal. Night was falling, and the darkness was gradually getting denser, and the cold, which is always more keenly during the process of digestion, made Boule de Suif shiver in spite of her fat. Did you know that? I learned this. I've watched myself eat and then become more colder. You feel the cold more. Why? Because you're digesting, and the blood runs from your extremities to your tummy to digest your food, and so you feel a little more cold. Madame de Ville offered her use of her foot warmer, in which the fuel had been renewed several times since the morning, and Boule de Suif accepted with alacrity, right? Graciousness since the morning, and clarity, and her feet were freezing. Of course they were. Madame Le Caramendon and Louisiel gave their foot warmers to the nuns. Look at it. After they eat together, they share together. Pardon me. All that eating is making me hungry. The driver lit his lamps. They shed a vivid glare on the cloud of steam rising from the cruppers of the two wheelers, and on the snow on both sides of the road, which seemed to be unrolling under the moving beams of light. It was no longer possible to make out anything inside the coach. Remember, it's pitch black, no lights, no nothing. But suddenly there was a movement between Boule de Suif and Cordonnet, and Louisiel, peering through the darkness, thought that he saw the bearded man start back as if he had received a sharp but silent blow. What happened? Some little points of light appeared in the road ahead, and it was toast, and they had been traveling for 11 hours. 4 halts and a half an hour each to allow the horses to eat their oats and recover the wind. They made 13 hours. They've been on the road for 13 hours in the cold. They entered the village and drew up to the front of the Hôtel du Commerce. The door opened, and a familiar sound made all of the travelers start. It was the clanking of a scabbard on the ground. Uh-oh! Immediately afterwards, something was shouted out in a German voice. Although the coach was stationary, nobody got out. It was as if they all expected to be murdered as soon as they emerged. And then the driver appeared holding one of his lanterns, which cast a sudden beam of light all the way down the coach, revealing 2 rows of frightened faces with mouths open and eyes bulging with terror and surprise. And standing beside the driver in full glare of the lantern was a German officer, a tall young man, incredibly slim, fair, in a uniform as tight-fitting as a woman's corset, and wearing on one side of his head a flat, shiny cap, which made him look like a page boy in an English hotel. His huge mustache, with its long, straight hairs tapering off imperceptibly and finishing on each side in a single fair hair, so fine that it was the end was invisible. It seemed to weigh down the corners of his mouth and dragging down his cheeks to give his lips a drooping appearance. Speaking in French, with an Alsatian accent, he invited the passengers to alight, saying curtly, "Please get out, ladies and gentlemen." The 2 nuns, of course, were the first to obey, with the meekness and pious women accustomed to absolute submission. And then the Count and Countess emerged, followed by the manufacturer and his wife. Next came Louisiel, pushing his better and larger half before him and saying, "Good evening, monsieur," to the officer as he set foot on the ground, more out of prudence than politeness. And the German, with the insolence of those who wield complete authority, looked at him without replying. Boule de Suif and Cordonnet, although they had been sitting nearest the door, they were the last to get out, facing the enemy with a grave and haughty air. The fat young woman was trying to keep her self-control and remain calm, while the Democrat was tugging angrily at his long red beard with a hand that trembled slightly. They were anxious to preserve their dignity, conscious that in the encounters of this kind, everybody is to some extent the representative of his country, and both were disgusted at their companion's obsequiousness, obedient and attentive to excessive servile. They were disgusted that their companions obeyed so easily. Boule de Suif wanted to show greater self-respect than her fellow travelers, the respectable women, while Courtenay realized that it behooved him to set an example. He continued in his whole attitude the task of resistance, which he had begun by blocking the roads. They all went into the great kitchen of the inn. And we're going to stop there. We're going to find out what happened in the next reading. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Boule de Suif. Boule de Suif by Guy de Maupassant, part 2 of 4-part reading. The travelers, traveling 13 hours, are now going into the inn of a Prussian-held town. Totes, right? My email is jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. I'd be very interested in your emails about this story. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. What do you think is going to happen? You can speculate, but we're going to find out. Every word you've been reading in the first 2 parts means something. He's painting a picture to the third-person narrator about what's to happen. So we already know something happened in that coach to Boule de Suif giving someone a slap. Loisio was trying to peer what happened, but it was too dark. So it's all speculation. And the third-person narrator isn't clear what happened, but we'll try to figure. Somebody made a move on Boule de Suif, right? We don't know who. We can guess. But thank you for listening and watching. Read other classics here with Jimmy. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy, reading with Jimmy. And we've been reading Guy de Maupassant. Tune in for part 3. Read other classics on this website. And thanks again for coming. Isn't this a great story? Oh, I love this story.